From the early 1st century BC to 960 AD, in what is modern-day Ethiopia and surrounding countries, there existed a large political entity. Some, like the Romans, would even call it an empire, comparing it to themselves. Yes, indeed, this empire was that powerful and mighty. This entity was known as the Axumite Empire, or the Empire of Axum. This large entity was the child of an earlier civilization, known as the Damat civilization, that had been present in the area of modern-day Ethiopia and on the coast of the Red Sea for at least a couple of thousand years before. This civilization probably came originally from the southern Arabic Peninsula, that is to say, the forefathers of the Damat civilization were South Semitic speaking peoples from what is modern-day Yemen and Oman. The Damat civilization collapsed, and Axum rose up in the aftermath of this collapse a couple of hundred years before Christ. This civilization left obelisks to commemorate and honor the gods and certain figures of importance, a tradition that would be continued by the later people of the Axum Empire. So this was the forefather of Axum. But Axum itself actually began as a small city, as a city-state, very similar to Rome, in the Tigray region of modern-day Ethiopia. Though unlike Rome's republican structure, this was a city-state or society dominated by a priest class, probably quite similar to the Punic-speaking Carthaginians, who seems to have had a similar system. And like Carthage and Rome, through both trade, diplomacy and war, Axum began to subdue and conquer its surrounding city-states, and later also other peoples that were not South Semitic-speaking peoples, into a net of allies and subservient kingdoms and buffer states, often in a rather brutal fashion, it should be said, that in certain ways might have been quite reminiscent of how the Aztecs expanded in Central America. And by the 2nd century, the city-state of Axum was the region's greatest power, and the leader of Axum was known by the title Nagusa Nagast, the King of Kings, as it's usually translated to, though the title actually has a lot of other meanings, related to representing and carrying out the will of gods, as the rulers of the Axumite Empire were supposed in theory to actually not rule so much as implement the divine will through a very complex system that I will not go into detail here. But speaking about the meaning of words, it's actually important to know that during this time, the Ge'ez script for language that was spoken in Axum was developed, and this script is still used to this very day in modern Ethiopian languages, such as Amharic and the like. And the Axumite Empire would continue to exist and be a very stable empire, with not much changes, until Ezana the Great came during the 4th century. Ezana the Great greatly expanded the empire, in the way people called great usually do things. You know, conquest and brutality, by destroying the kingdom of Moro in modern-day Sudan and southern Egypt, and also expanding and subjugating the tribes of Pont, an area that is today Somalia. But his most important action was that he converted to Christianity and acknowledged Christianity as now being the dominant religion within the Axumite Empire. And thus the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church was born. A Miaphysite church, that is to say, a church that believes that the divine essence and human essence were incarnated in one person in Jesus, rather than the Roman Christian position that Jesus was one person with two natures that can be divided from each other. Thus it shares the same theological view of Jesus as the Coptic Church in Egypt. And in fact, the Ethiopic Orthodox Church is a church in communion with the Egyptian Coptic Church and was in theory under the same jurisdiction, but in practice it was a separate church, though only granted autonomy from the Coptic Church in 1959. And still to this day, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is the majority religion of Ethiopia, though there exist also Muslim minorities and some other Christian groups there. One interesting aspect about this church is that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is a church with biblical canon that say which texts are included in the Bible is actually rather different from the Western Roman tradition, as the Ethiopic Church never became crystallized exactly in which texts were to be included in the Bible, and thus they created a sort of little canon that is all the agreed upon texts that are to be included in the Bible, and a greater canon, which differs from each congregation and place in the Ethiopic Orthodox Church. Some local places will have some other definitions of what is included in the Bible than others. It is also interesting and important to note that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church borrowed heavily from local Jewish tradition, as much of the Old Testament in the Ethiopic Orthodox Christian tradition is the same as the version used by the local Jews, rather than versions used by Jews elsewhere. This is probably a result of the fact that a large Jewish presence existed within the Axumite Empire from its very beginning, and Jewish traditions were adopted into the Axumite Empire through cultural exchange. And just like the Jews, that they adopted a lot of things from, they kept the old law of the Old Testament. So the Ethiopic Orthodox Church is orthopractical, that is to say focused upon law and concrete rules, in a way that most other churches are not. As a result of this, the Axumite period saw a law system based upon these Christian texts develop, which would be further refined into the law code of Fathanagast during the Solomonic dynasty period, a later empire based in Ethiopia. And with Ezana's conversion to Christianity, the churches became important administrative centers and were responsible for everything from tax collection, law implementation, to the raising of troops, a function they had probably inherited from the previous system of priest rulers that existed in Axum, so there is some continuity here. Despite this conversion, the same system stays or gets introduced into the Christianity of this time. In any case, during the time of Ezana, and arguably even before that, but especially during the time of Ezana, Axum became a chief rival of both Rome and the Sassanid Persian Empire, and fought actually for power and influence against both, and sometimes allied with one or the other in order to fight the other. For example, Persia and Ezana against Rome initially, then later emperors such as Caleb would ally with Rome against Persia, when Caleb tried to invade the Arabic Peninsula, leading to a rather famous event known as the Year of the Elephant in Islamic traditions. And it is important to be aware of the fact that Axum was almost as large as Persia, and by some population estimates even larger in population size. So it was considered a pretty big deal when they tried to invade the Arabic Peninsula, and this has thus been recorded in Islamic history due to the importance of this. Speaking about Islamic history, Axum would actually host a lot of Muslims fleeing from persecution in the Mecca area at the early stages of Islam. Yet, with the rise of Islam, which would conquer the Arabic Peninsula, Persia and most of the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire, including Egypt in the north, Axum would be cut off to a certain degree from the rest of the Christian world, though they were always pretty distinct due to their very special form of Christianity. And to the Axum Empire, this was now just a new and bigger rival to contend with and sometimes wage war against. However, Axum could actually not just go north to attack Egypt, which was under Islamic control, easily due to a network of buffer states that hindered war in that direction. So most wars became naval wars with raids along the Red Sea. Actually, the town port of Jeddah got raided, and according to some sources, Axum forces actually raided Mecca, but the Arabic sources disagree, or rather do not mention it. And my point with pointing out this raid against Jeddah and possibly even Mecca is to show that the Axum Empire actually was a powerful rival to the early Islamic caliphates. However, Axum was actually more than just a rival, and trade actually continued. Though the Arabs were contesting old sea trade routes, Axum had always been a large trading entity, essential part of the Ethiopian Yemeni Indian trade, a triangle trading network that was truly enormous in size. And the southern Arabic Peninsula was one of the main buyers of one of the commodities sold by Axum. And now you will be asking, what did the Axumite Empire sell? You might ask. Well, aside from various spices and plantation goods, they were the main providers of slaves to the Arabic and Indian markets. And this was when they didn't use the slaves themselves in order to produce other goods that they were selling. Axum was from the very beginning a slave economy, just like the Romans and the Arabs that they traded with. And their slavery can mostly be compared to how the Spartans treated the Helots. And there is a reason as to why Arabic and Islamic sayings make use of the Habashi slave, or the Axumite slave, in other words, as an example of the most downtrodden and lowest man on earth. Yeah, Axum slavery deserves its own video to describe. Anyway, yet despite this cruelty that existed in the slave usage, this trade and use of slave labor to create products for trade still made Axum into a flourishing culture and economy that was even organized enough to have standardized coinage, something that was very rare and pretty much only Rome and China have also done it before. And it would not be common for states to have standardized coinage until the period of the Renaissance, several hundreds of years after the fall of Axum. And speaking about the fall of Axum, Axum began to face issues in the 10th century, ironically partially due to the Arabic world during this time facing economic issues. And as they were an important trade partner, they faced them in turn. And the Axumite Empire was finally destroyed in the 10th century by the possibly Jewish queen Judith. And a new empire would not appear until the Sagwe dynasty, and then later the Solomonic dynasty, claimed the Axum legacy as their own. Axum, like Rome and the Islamic Rashidun Caliphate, became a foundational empire that was viewed as an ideal by later Ethiopic culture to strive towards its revival. A golden age where Ethiopic culture flourished. Just as I stated about Rome and the Rashidun Caliphate, Queen and Han China, in my previous video about foundational empires. This is really important to understand about Axum. It was a foundational empire, an empire of culture that produced more text from after the fall of the Roman Empire coming from this empire than we have from almost the entirety of Europe during the same time. And remember, as Europe was in the midst of the chaos of the Dark Ages in Europe after the fall of Rome, Axum stood as an example of high culture in the world, comparable to the great civilizations of the Eastern Romans, the Persians, and later the Arabic caliphates. And I hope, my dear viewers, that you have found this African empire interesting. And if you have any questions about this rather brief overview of this great empire and its history, or if you want to see more history about this empire, then tell so in the comment sections. I will try to answer and interact with you as quickly as possible and to the best of my ability. Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities. اشترك بالقناة من فضلكم.